Recently, I have been focusing on stocking up our homestead pantry with some home canned soups, and today I'm doing up another batch for the pressure canner, and I thought I would share this recipe with you because it will be a great staple to have on hand for the cooler months. I always like to keep our pantry stocked with some shelf-stable convenience meals, and soups are a perfect addition for this. All it takes is opening up a jar, adding it to a pot, heating, and you have a quick and healthy meal ready to go. This recipe is for a simple but delicious beef and vegetable soup. It doesn't require a whole lot of time prep-wise. The most time-consuming part of this is just waiting on the pressure canner, so it's a great task to do when there are other things to get done in the kitchen. While this isn't a tested recipe, all of the ingredients are considered perfectly safe to pressure can, and this is what I would consider common sense canning. There are guidelines for canning your own homemade soups, and I'll leave that information down below if it's something that you'd like to reference. Those guidelines recommend fully cooking the soup and then hot packing into jars. I prefer not to hot pack for soups though, and I'll share more on that later. To start out, I'm getting my vegetables prepped. This soup has a mixture of potatoes, onions, garlic, and I also do some frozen mixed vegetables as well to keep it simple. I just use a mix of green beans, carrots, peas, and corn. I'm starting out with peeling up my potatoes, and then I'm going to get those diced and added into a bowl. I'll top those potatoes off with some cold water while I prep the rest of the ingredients, and that is going to help to pull out some of the starch from the potatoes, and it's going to help to keep the broth really nice and clear while it's on the shelf. No soup is complete without onions and garlic, so that's the next thing that I'm prepping. I'm just dicing up some yellow onion and mincing some garlic. I like to do about 1 large clove of garlic per quart jar of soup. I'm canning in quart jars today, and my pressure canner fits 7 quarts, so that's what I'll be doing, but you could easily do pints instead. It would just be half the amount of ingredients per jar. Pints are also really nice to have on hand because they're the perfect size for a single serving. Now, as I mentioned, I'm using frozen mixed vegetables. You could easily substitute in fresh of this mixture, but just for convenience sake, I'm using the frozen mix today. I did go ahead and just pull some of those mixed vegetables out of the freezer and add them into a bowl to thaw them just a bit so they aren't going into the jars totally frozen, so I can avoid shocking the jars when I top them off with the hot broth. Once I had the vegetables all prepped and ready to go, I got a large skillet heating on the stovetop with just a little bit of tallow to cook up the ground beef. 2 pounds is perfect for 7 quarts of soup, and I am just partially cooking and browning the ground beef. No need to fully cook it, as it will continue to cook through the pressure canning process. This will just help to avoid the ground beef from turning into essentially a meatloaf inside your jar. Once I had all of my other ingredients prepped and ready to go, I went ahead and drained off the potatoes, gave them another rinse just to get off any of that excess starch, and I also got some broth heating. I have my quart jars all clean and hot, ready to go. They don't need to be sterilized though when pressure canning. For soups, I prefer to do this method where I am just equally measuring out the ingredients into each jar over hot packing. That way I can make sure that everything is evenly divided, and obviously it just saves a little bit of time with not having to cook everything. And to each quart jar, I'm adding some of the ground beef. Just going to evenly divide that between the jars, and then I'll get this topped off with the vegetables and the seasonings. I really enjoy canning my own recipes, and I think it's something that you just have to figure out if you're comfortable with over time. I know not everyone will agree with that. Understanding safe canning practices first and what is and isn't considered safe to can at home, and then going from there, you get to decide what you're going to do in your own kitchen. And for some, that might be full-on rebel canning. For others, that might be only tested recipes. I find myself somewhere in the middle again with what I would consider common sense canning. This beef and vegetable soup is one of those super simple but comforting meals. It's perfect for a quick lunch or dinner. So again, between my jars, I'm dividing up the potatoes, the mixed vegetables, along with some onion and garlic as well. Now, the base of the soup is going to be a tomato and broth base, so I'm adding to my jars some diced tomatoes. Feel free to just dice up fresh tomatoes for those, but we are past tomato season here. Most of mine are still in the freezer for me to deal with. I do, however, have lots of diced tomatoes that I canned this year, so I'm just using some of those, and then I'm going to go ahead and add in my seasonings. I like to add a little bit of tomato paste per jar, and I'll also season with some salt and pepper, basil, oregano. This makes for a very simple soup, but again, super delicious, and feel free to play around with the seasonings based on your preference. You could also leave the tomatoes and tomato paste out and just have this as a broth base. That would also be great, but we love this soup just as it is. Once my broth was hot and ready to go, I went ahead and ladled that into my jars to 1 inch of headspace, and then I'm going to get these jars debubbled. Make sure that the rims are really clean. I like to use a little bit of vinegar anytime that I'm canning anything that has any fat. So with the beef and the broth, I just want to make sure that the rims are really nice and clean so that the lids get a good seal. I am adding on my lids. I'm adding on some rings to fingertip tight, no tighter, and that will prevent them from buckling in the canner. And then these are going to be ready for processing. To my canner, I'm adding in 3 quarts of water. I'm also adding in a splash of vinegar, which will help prevent mineral buildup on the jars. Adding my jars to the pressure canner, I'm going to close up the lid, get this heating, and once I see a steady stream of steam coming from the vent pipe, I'll allow the canner to vent for 10 minutes. Then I'll add on the regulator and get the canner up to pressure. I'm using a dial gauge pressure canner, so I'm processing at 11 pounds of pressure. If you are using a weighted gauge pressure canner, you'll want to process at 10 pounds of pressure. As always, adjusting that for elevation as needed. Since I'm doing quart jars, these are going to process for 90 minutes. If you wanted to do pints, you absolutely could, and they would process for 75. Once the processing time is up, I like to crack the lid for a couple minutes to allow it to gradually cool before I go ahead and take off the lid. And then I'll allow the jars to sit in the canner for an additional few minutes. And this will just help to avoid siphoning. If you ever see a lot of liquid loss, this is a good way to help prevent that. This is the third batch of this soup that I've done in the last couple weeks, and we're already going through it quite quickly. If you give this recipe a try, I hope you love it as much as we do. As always, the full recipe will be in the description box down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.